Hi friends, I don't like commander damage. Now, allow me to be clear here. Commander damage doesn't bother me because I think it's unfair or unbalanced or because I've gotten Voltron killed too many times. No, commander damage bothers me because I think it's a poorly implemented rule. I think the current version of commander damage causes more problems than it offers benefits. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have commander damage, but instead that I think we can make a better version of it. That's the wonderful thing about games. They are malleable collections of rules that we can and should experiment with. So that's what we're doing today. I want to show you the problems that I see with commander damage, and then I will suggest some alternative solutions. But first, I would like to briefly explain one of the main lenses which will focus our discussion: game complexity. Generally, I think it's good for games to keep their rules as minimal as possible. That's not to say that I'm opposed to complicated games. I like Dota 2, Smash Melee, and of course, I play Magic the Gathering. I am an enjoyer of complicated games. However, visible game complexity is a limited resource. If a game becomes too complicated, it stops being an enjoyable experience. Let's take League of Legends for example and add a new creep camp that's a green buff in addition to the already existing red and blue. That would probably be fine. Adding just one more buff doesn't seem too complicated. So let's keep going. Let's add a purple buff, a yellow buff, a horseshoe buff, a roof tiling buff, and a buff that's only available at 3 PM on Sunday afternoons. Eventually there comes a point where it's just too much. It's too difficult to keep track of and it feels overwhelming without adding anything of substance. Complexity is a budget, and if you use too much of it, then either the core gameplay gets lost in it or players start ignoring parts of it. Stripping unrequired rules or simplifying complicated ones allows for more complexity within the meat of a game, and this is equally true for simple and complex games. For a game like Magic the Gathering, which is already very complicated, we want the lowest possible amount of rules complexity for the base game, so that we can then have lots of room for rules complexity of individual cards without the players feeling overwhelmed. So, what is commander damage and why does it exist? Commander damage makes it so that whenever a commander deals a total of 21 or more combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. Unfortunately, there's no game design document available for Commander, so I can only speculate as to why it exists. Now, let me start out by saying that I believe Commander damage has and needs justification. Most of Commander follows the rules laid out by regular Magic the Gathering, and if we simply remove Commander damage, the rest of the game would still function just fine. It's an additional layer that's been placed on top. It came from a place of intention. My best guess would be that it was implemented to make commanders feel more special. They don't just deal combat damage, they also deal commander damage, which gives them a uniquely threatening presence. And I think that's a valid idea. Having your commander feel important in a distinct way is valuable and should be preserved. But the current implementation of this rule carries some heavy baggage. Remember, we want to minimize core rule complexity so we can spend our complexity budget on fun card designs. In a game of Commander, every player has 40 life. But that's not actually true. Every player has 40 life and then also a separate individual health bar for each player's commander, including their own. So instead of having one life bar, each player actually has 5, and they all need to be tracked separately for each individual commander. This complicates the game severely and becomes difficult to maintain in a physical space. From my experience, players usually carry some sort of life tracker with them to manage their own HP, but nobody carries 4 additional ones just for commander damage. Instead, they cope in a variety of different ways, often by awkwardly stacking dice on the corner of their playmat facing the corresponding player. It's confusing and easy to get wrong. The best way to track commander damage is via apps like LifeTap, but that means that this one rule has introduced the need for a digital device into a purely physical game. This need only becomes more pressing once we start pushing the limits of commander damage, as partner commanders need to be tracked separately. If we take this to its extremes, we end up with 8 additional health bars per player. Instead of only having 4 life bars, commander damage turns that into a variable quantity starting at 20 up to a maximum of 36. I have no idea how that could possibly be tracked without a digital device. If I was designing Commander, then this issue alone would already be disqualifying. One of Magic's greatest strengths is its physicality. Only the cards themselves are needed to play it. Joke sets aside, Wizards have never encroached on this principle. But commander damage does, by pushing complexity to a degree that digital assistance becomes necessary. This complexity takes a burden on all players, but is especially noticeable for beginners. Magic is already a difficult game, and new players often struggle to keep track of the core rules, 4 different board states, the cards in their hand, and then also having to manage threat assessment. If we then add a bare minimum of 3 additional health bars per player into the mix, it just becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, I think a fair counterpoint here would be to say that new players will always struggle and that there's really no one specific thing we can point to that's the leading cause. But I disagree with that, although I can only tell you about my anecdotal experience. From what I have observed, the additional complexity introduced by commander damage hits harder than the other natural complexities of the game, visibly taking up a disproportionate amount of concentration. And I theorize that that's because health is something that players assume is intuitive. They expect to easily understand it because it's part of the universal language of games. They might even be used to regular Magic, which abides by this vocabulary. So when it then isn't as obvious as they expect it to be, it starts taking up a lot of learning capacity. I found that the best way to get new players acclimated to Commander is to only introduce commander damage at a later point. I understand that some of you might look at the issues I just mentioned and decide that they don't bother you. Many players already carry digital devices specifically to act as life trackers for their table. And sure, there are some issues for newer players, but Commander is already so complex that it needs to be learned step by step anyways. If you feel that way, then that's fine. However, that is a player perspective. As players, we are often open to putting up with inconveniences because we like the rest of the game enough to deal with them, and sometimes those inconveniences become part of the charm. But when discussing rule adjustments, we need to look through a developer lens, and from this point of view, we should view those inconveniences as opportunities for improvement. If we find good solutions, those charming elements can often be maintained as we fix problems. And the search for those solutions requires us to understand all of the game's problems, both major and minor. We need to see the complete picture, even if that means investigating issues that players have already gotten used to or even implemented their own solutions for. I think that the complexity of commander damage is an enormous problem, but let's set this aside and continue on exploring my other concerns. Players have to deal 21 commander damage for it to have an effect. But why 21? That's an awkward number. Life totals are 40. Wouldn't 20, the halfway point, make more sense and be more intuitive? I think we can actually decipher the reason for this oddity. In the original version of Commander, Elder Dragon Highlander, players were only allowed to choose one of the 5 Elder Dragon cards as their commander, and all of those were creatures with exactly 7 power. They were also really bad. It makes sense to me to assume that at the time it was decided that 3 attacks from a commander equals a kill, because frankly, if you got hit 3 times by those things, you deserve to lose. However, eventually the Elder Dragon restriction was lifted, and any legendary creature was allowed to be played as a commander. And my guess is that the 3 attacks from an Elder Dragon were then just translated into 21 damage. But 21 is a bad threshold. 21 only divides into 3 and 7, which feels like it's been deliberately chosen to minimize how many creatures can actually get there without going into significant overkill. 20 on the other hand would divide into 2, 4, 5 and 10 and work well with 3 and 7, and it would be more intuitive being half the starting life total instead of half plus 1. If commander damage is intended to be a common factor, then it should have a requirement of 20, not 21. But that raises an interesting question. How often is commander damage even supposed to matter? I play a lot of Commander, and I watch way too much Commander content. And from my experience, Commander damage kills are rare. It's just difficult to deal 21 damage. Most Commanders just can't reach that number cleanly. And that means that more often than not, Commander damage gets tracked, only to be completely inconsequential because the game ends before it activates. The popular commanders in 2024 just aren't 7/7 dragons anymore, and instead are value engines like Yada or enablers like Ishin, or both like Yuriko, Hensi, Arcades, Sauron, Miss Bumbleflower, and I could keep going for days. But pure beaters as commanders? That's rare. Even newer printings of the original Elder Dragons usually don't have 7/7 stats anymore, and instead focus on powerful, non-combat centered effects. So, in most matches, commander damage consumes part of our complexity budget without actually coming into play. But, importantly, it still has to be tracked, just in case. That's not good. If we have a rule that requires this much attention, then I think it should be an important component of the game. We can have simple rules that only rarely come into play, or complicated ones that are in our core essence. But we shouldn't have complicated rules that seldom matter. This is where Voltron decks come in. Voltron is a style that tries to win by buffing their commander and dealing specifically commander damage. These decks lean into this rule and make it their primary win condition. This is interesting, cool, and worth preserving. It's a very unique style of gameplay that's enabled specifically by commander damage. But Voltron is famously fragile, because if their commander gets destroyed, then they lose their only source of commander damage. Currently, commander damage is a parasitic mechanic, meaning it only synergizes with itself. Only our commander can deal our commander damage. While players can buff their commander to make it deal more damage, other than that, nothing synergizes with it. I can't commander lightning bolt somebody. Worse even, commander damage is anti-synergistic with the core health mechanics and the main win condition of Magic the Gathering. We can't use other creatures to help deal commander damage, and the other players in a game can't finish off somebody we dealt 20 commander damage to. This parasitic element also goes the other way. If we're doing too much damage with the rest of our deck, then the fact that our commander is dealing commander damage becomes wasted because our opponent dies before we could hit the necessary threshold. Voltron decks struggle with this issue tremendously, and the only way around this is to be fast and to target players individually. One of the many unique elements of Commander is that it's a social game. It's more cooperative than competitive. For me, and for many other people, that means that I try to spread out the damage I deal. I don't want to focus an individual player out of the game early, because if I do, then they have to wait around until either we finish playing or they have to look for a different table with an open spot, and then our table has to search for a fourth player again, and none of that is great. Ideally, we want the game to come to an end at around the same time for all players. This doesn't have to be perfectly accurate. It's fine if somebody has to wait a little bit. We just want to minimize that wait time. Unfortunately, Commander doesn't have a rule that encourages this kind of positive behavior, that encourages us to spread out our damage. And that's honestly something we can explore in a video in the future, but not today. But Commander does have a rule that encourages the opposite, that encourages targeting individuals. Commander damage only comes into effect if a player has taken a significant sum total of it, meaning we have to stack it on the same target repeatedly. After a player has dealt commander damage to an opponent once, they are incentivized to keep attacking that same player, regardless of board state. This creates two sources of social conflict. First, we have players getting knocked out too early, and then second, we also have a feeling of hostility that some might experience as they are getting repeatedly attacked, even when they are not a threat. The social aspect of Commander is one of its three major design pillars, but it's getting compromised by the current version of this rule. Now, I think, is a good moment to talk about the elephant in the room, which is Lifegain. Lifegain decks are a fairly common archetype in Commander, and a frequent argument I hear is that Commander damage is needed to stifle Lifegain decks. Lifegain decks, they say, will gain huge amounts of HP, and without Commander damage, there wouldn't be a way to win against them. This argument makes some sense, but we have to ask ourselves if this is really a big enough problem to justify all of the other issues that come along with Commander damage. Do we need a rule intrinsic to the game that exists specifically to manage Lifegain decks? Are they that oppressive? And if that's the case, should we then consider rules to manage other strategies too? For example, should a player lose the game if they play more than 5 spells in a turn, or if they control more than 10 creatures? I would argue no. None of these strategies are enough of a problem that we need core rules that reduce their effectiveness. The strongest strategy in the game isn't Lifegain, it's infinite combos, and those destroy Lifegain. However, I am aware that the biggest complaints are actually levied not at regular Lifegain decks, but infinite Lifegain decks. Commander damage offers an alternative win condition in those scenarios, where there might not remain a different way to win. This is a valid complaint, but in my opinion, it's one that needs to be solved on a social level rather than a rules level. If a player can gain infinite life, then that is a combo. It's only different from a player dealing infinite damage in the way that it's worse and that it doesn't actually end the game, which is frustrating. But if one player is playing a deck with an infinite combo in it, then this is presumably a table at which that's been discussed and was agreed upon, in which case we should ask the other players at the table if they have their own combos or alternative win conditions still available, and if not, then we concede. However, if this came out of nowhere and the table wasn't in agreement that infinite combos are okay, then that is an issue that stemmed from either a lack of communication, miscommunication, or disguised intent. And those issues aren't unique to Lifegain and shouldn't be solved on a Lifegain specific level. I hope that at this point I have illustrated that Commander damage currently has many problems with its design. But I actually think the core idea is worth preserving. Commander damage does add a feeling of our commander being special, and it has allowed for the creation of a unique archetype. So my suggestion today isn't to remove commander damage, even though that would be easiest, and I would argue that would already be an improvement. But instead, I would like to rework it. I think we can fix commander damage. I have 3 ideas I want to present to you. Now, this part of the video is always the scariest bit because it exposes just how much of a design fraud I am. So, to make sure that I'm not the only one getting embarrassed today, let me know your ideas. Let me know your suggestions. How do you think we can address the problems with commander damage while preserving the good things it brings? I do think there are a lot of possible solutions to this, and I would be delighted to hear your ideas. Alright, leave them down in the comments. I'll give you a moment. Okay, so here are mine. My first solution is quite similar to how commander damage works right now, with the change being that commander damage is no longer tracked individually for each commander, but instead as a sum total of all commanders. A player still loses the game once they've taken a sum total of commander damage, but it no longer matters where that damage came from. It can come from different commanders from different players. Of course, the threshold would have to be adjusted. 40 seems like a nice and intuitive number. Maybe 30 is better for Voltron. This would be much simpler to keep track of, as all players now only have 1 additional health bar. We hopefully maintain Voltron strategies, and this rule continues to hate out Lifegain decks, if that's something you care about. My second idea is similar, but changes things up just a tad bit more. Commander damage as a win condition as opposed to a loss condition. Whenever a player deals commander damage, that is added to their own commander damage pool, and once that pool reaches some appropriate number that we find in playtesting, probably 40, that player wins the game. This fixes all the same issues the first idea did, while also helping our social friction problems and probably being better for Voltron. It could also lead to fun moments of players protecting each other so that the commander damage player doesn't get those last hits in. I like this idea, but I know that alternative win conditions aren't something that everybody enjoys. I also think it's still a bit too complicated for my taste. Ideally, I would like to remove the need for additional health bars altogether. So here's my final proposal, which is my personal favorite. Commander damage is no longer tracked as a separate value, and instead, whenever a player loses life from a commander dealing combat damage to them, they lose that much life again. Basically, commanders deal double combat damage to players, but this can be used to double the effectiveness of elements like lifelink or combat damage triggers. This would do wonders at reducing the complexity of commander damage. Additionally, commanders would still feel uniquely powerful, but in a way that's much more likely to matter, since even a single attack could make a big difference. Within this new system, Voltron decks could still exist, but they would no longer be relying on a parasitic mechanic, meaning they could benefit from alternative sources of damage. Commander damage would also no longer offer any additional incentive to target down individual players, easing social friction. However, I have to acknowledge that this change would make commander damage worse against Lifegain decks, which is something I am fine with. It would also effectively lower the overall health of all players in the game by increasing the damage output of our commanders. This would result in faster games, but I am also fine with that. I've actually taken this new commander damage rule to my local community and asked them to try it out with me, because I was worried that that last consequence would negatively impact the game, and I was very positively surprised. Commanders felt super powerful, but in a really fair way, as it made combat highly interactive. Even a small hit from a 2 damage commander became noticeable, and as soon as higher damage commanders started getting involved, players were blocking much more actively than what I was used to. From my current experience, players will often simply tank a 6 damage hit from a commander and then shrug it off. But with this new rule, those 6 damage became 12, and that wasn't easy to ignore. Every commander became a powerhouse that required consideration for blocking. And because of that, breaking through stale board states became much easier. The games felt fast and dynamic in a way that I thought was really enjoyable. On top of that, all of our games were much easier to track for everybody, because there were only 4 numbers that we had to keep in mind. I originally thought that this ease of understanding would mostly help newbies, but even very enfranchised players benefited from it, as less of the complexity budget was wasted and they got to focus more on the actual game. When we started, I assumed I would need to do some convincing to get people to playtest this rule for multiple games. But after we played it once, everybody was happy to keep going. It felt like a genuine improvement to the format. I would be delighted if you were to try it and then told me about your experience. Maybe you don't like it as much as I do, maybe you do, maybe you have an idea of how it could be improved. There's always room for more innovation. That's the great thing about games, we can always keep designing. In fact, I think my suggestion here is still a bit clunky. A much cleaner version of this would be to simply have commanders deal double combat damage. Against players, against creatures, just always double damage. I do think this is the more refined design. But I am a bit hesitant to suggest this, because it would have wide-reaching balance implications that would destabilize a lot of decks, since certain triggers would become vastly more powerful. That's not necessarily a bad thing, maybe this version of Commander would be better. In our current Commander damage suggestion, we have a safety measure in place that I'm not sure is necessary, but it probably has to exist because we would otherwise take too big of a step. But let me know how you feel about it. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble about one rule that I don't like in a game that I very much do like. Despite all of my praise for the third solution, currently me and my friends just play without commander damage. We just have it turned off and we like it more that way. But I do think there's merit to the idea. I just think the current version of it is really lacking and we can do better. We can do better. Look, that's just That's just definitive. I'm pretty sure that this is not the best version of commander damage, because this version of commander damage has actually been around since at least 2002. I'm currently working on a video about the complete design history of commander, and I'm just kind of trying to figure out when all of the rules were first implemented. And commander damage has actually been here since the very beginning, but it has remained unchanged. Unlike everything else, color identity was reworked, the way commanders worked were reworked, the idea of being allowed to have more than one copy of each commander per local community was reworked. But somehow commander damage just stuck around in its prototypical form, in its form. Like, I don't know what was going on there. Okay, anyway, sorry, I'm getting a little bit rambly. Thank you very much for watching the video. I greatly appreciate it. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. I would definitely appreciate that as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to join us for our Friday community commander streams, where every Friday we play some commander together. Go check out everything in the description, and I'll see you guys sometime.